The masked wrestler has been a long-standing tradition in the industry, one which originally began in South America and has given us some truly iconic performers such as El Santo and Blue Demon. But of course, as with any great idea, it wouldn't take long before it spread out across the entire world. And so, while out east, the likes of Tiger Mask and Jushin Thunder Liger were making waves, up in North America, WWE were largely flying the flag for the American version of masked wrestlers. But who were the best of them all? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into Behind the Masks, WWE's greatest masked wrestlers. Let's start off with someone who, despite spending most of his career in Japan, would have two notable runs in North America, and that's Ultimo Dragon. Yes, between 1996 and 1998, the man who popularized the Asai moonsault would have a stint with World Championship Wrestling, there performing as part of their cruiserweight division. That said, it wouldn't be until 2003 that after signing with WWE, he would get introduced to a whole new global audience when he became part of the SmackDown brand. And while he would never have the same level of success in Vince McMahon's company that he did elsewhere, he would still make his mark during a run which saw him get to wrestle the likes of Jamie Noble, Tajiri, and Eddie Guerrero, all while achieving two of his greatest ambitions by performing at a WrestleMania and also appearing at Madison Square Garden, both of which would happen in 2004. Following this, though, feeling disheartened by how low he was being used within the company, Ultimo Dragon would ask for his release, as from there, he returned to his homeland. But while he may have been disappointed with how things played out for himself in WWE, the same could not be said of one of his opponents during this run, arguably the greatest luchador of all time, Rey Mysterio. Of course, everyone knows Rey Mysterio. He's probably the most famous masked wrestler on the planet, and there's a good reason for this, as while his career may have got its first big break back in WCW during the Monday Night Wars, it wouldn't be until he arrived in WWE in 2002 that things really reached the next level for him. And this would see him get so over with fans that despite being too small for Vince McMahon's tastes at just 5'6", the boss would be forced to shoot him to the top of the card anyway, with him having a memorable run as part of the SmackDown 6 during the early 2000s. But even that wouldn't be his greatest achievement in WWE, because after the death of his close friend Eddie Guerrero in 2005, Rey would make it his goal to become World Heavyweight Champion in his honor, something he managed to book his shot at after entering the 2006 Royal Rumble in the number 2 spot, and then going on to win the whole thing. After that, he'd meet Kurt Angle and Randy Orton in a triple threat match at WrestleMania 22, where against the odds, the diminutive star was able to win the big one, something which came much to the delight of his many fans. And sure, while his title reign following this wasn't the best, this was through no fault of his own, as with his innovative use of high-flying theatrics, Rey remained a standout wrestler of any show he was on, something which continued well past the point he dropped the belt and moved on to feuds with the likes of Chavo Guerrero and Edge. So it should come as no surprise then that by 2009, title success would come his way once more when he became the Intercontinental Champion for a period, a belt he'd won after retiring JBL in just 35 seconds at WrestleMania 25. Following this, he'd enter into an extended feud with Chris Jericho, one which represented some of the best work of each man, all before then segueing into programs with Batista and CM Punk. Then, as a reward for all his years of service, in 2011, following a second run with the World Heavyweight title, the Lucha Star would finally get a one-night reign with the true top prize in the company when he'd win the tournament to crown the new WWE Champion, beating The Miz in the finals. After this, he'd begin to wind down the card, settling into more of a Legends role and eventually leaving WWE for a period in 2015. When he returned again 3 years later, he'd begin easing his son Dominic into storylines as he started acting as his tag team partner and now rival. But while Rey may now be in the twilight portion of his career, it's been a hell of a run, and one that no other lucha star has been able to match, not even his one-time tag team partner, Sin Cara. Now, Sin Cara is an interesting one, because he's actually been portrayed by two different people. First by Mexican star Místico in 2011, and then later that year by a Mexican-American performer, confusingly also named Místico. And the reason for this change was that, despite being a star in his home country, the first Sin Cara was never really able to adapt to the WWE style, something which left him floundering as the imposter version of his character quickly usurped him. But things didn't work out much better for this new Sin Cara either, as it happened, as he would go through many of the same issues. The original Sin Cara teamed up with Rey Mysterio for a period, while the second incarnation was repackaged as Unico, and then later donned the mask again as he was put into a tag team with Kalisto that would go by the name of the Lucha Dragons following the release of the original Sin Cara. Yes, it just goes to show that while you can be a great performer, not everyone is able to excel in different styles. And this would also at times be a problem for our next subject, Vader. Of course, Vader is one of the all-time greats. That much is indisputable. But most of the success would come during his stints with New Japan Pro Wrestling and WCW, where he came to dominate the main event scene, regularly winning world titles in each. And so upon his arrival in WWE in 1996, the initial plans were for him to carry on in the same vein. That was until he came up against the notoriously difficult Shawn Michaels, who, unwilling to drop the WWE title to the Mastodon at that year's SummerSlam, would get the finish changed at the last minute, killing much of his opponent's momentum in the process. But that's not to say Vader didn't have any success in WWE. No, when used right, he could still look like an absolute killer. And this was no more evident than in his matches with the likes of Ken Shamrock and Kane in the years that followed. That said, there definitely was the feeling that given his success elsewhere, he could have been so much more if management had just ran with him, something they sadly would never fully do, with this contributing towards him leaving the promotion altogether in 1998. So thankfully then, finally realizing the error of their ways, WWE have since decided to induct him into their 2022 Hall of Fame class, putting him right where he deserves to be as one of the greats in the industry. And right there with him amongst the greats is another legendary masked wrestler, someone who actually made a name for himself fighting Vader in WCW, and that's Mankind. Sure, at that point he was going by Cactus Jack, but whether it's him, Mankind, or Dude Love, Mick Foley has always remained one of the most popular figures in WWE. When he first arrived in 1996, though, it was as a dastardly heel, as at this point, Mankind was portrayed as a Hannibal Lecter-inspired psychopath, one which managed to regularly get the better of his chief rival, The Undertaker. On top of this, the sadistic incarnation of the character would also allow Foley to express his incredible creativity, as pretty quickly, he would have developed one of the most layered characters the company had ever seen at the time, with this eventually turning him babyface the following year. From here, the hardcore legend would regularly switch between his three gimmicks, but in the end, it always seemed to be Mankind who got the most memorable moments, none of which were more memorable than King of the Ring 1998, where during another war with The Undertaker, Foley would be thrown off the top of the Hell in a Cell in arguably the most iconic moment of the Attitude Era. And if you thought that this was the only madness Mankind would inflict upon himself at this point, then you'd be very wrong, as at the 1999 Royal Rumble, he'd arguably go one better when, during an I Quit match with The Rock, he'd take 11 brutal, unprotected chair shots to the head. But this incident would finally force him to calm down afterwards, as with his body simply unable to take the punishment anymore, Mankind would turn into more of a comedic character from there, one less known for his incredibly violent matches and more known for his sidekick sock puppet, Mr. Socko. And this would last up until 2000, at which point he would retire from full-time in-ring competition. With this also marking the end of the Mankind character too, as it happened, because every time he returned following this, it would be as himself. But while his career would come to a close at this point, another of his peers' runs was just getting started, as with a couple of decades still left in him, Kane would end up becoming one of the longest-running characters WWE has ever seen. And part of this is because of the gimmick's malleability. Yes, whether it be heel or babyface, scary villain or comedic goof, Kane can seemingly do it all and bring joy to fans while he's at it. That said, bringing joy certainly wasn't what was on his mind when he debuted in 1997, as, after Paul Bearer had spent the entire summer warning The Undertaker that his younger brother was still alive and had survived the fire that had killed his parents all those years ago, the Big Red Machine would make his debut during the first ever Hell in a Cell match that October. After that, he'd spend the next few months demanding the dead man face him one-on-one, with the consistent refusals he received only serving to anger him more, as he then set about laying waste to everyone else on the roster until he got what he wanted. And eventually, he would get this at WrestleMania 14, when he and The Undertaker went one-on-one in the first of many encounters they would have throughout 1998. But those encounters wouldn't always see them at each other's throats, as by the spring, they would have mended fences, there teaming up for a while until the point that Taker would turn on his brother, turning heel and causing the Big Red Machine to become a babyface for the first time. This then would turn him into an unlikely fan favorite, as seeing something of him in themselves, outcasts everywhere began taking to Kane as one of their own, with him continuing to be one of the most popular figures on the roster for the next few years, even at one point reuniting with The Undertaker to form the Brothers of Destruction. This would all change in 2002, however, as after being forced to unmask and reveal that his scars had been psychological all along and not physical, the Big Red Machine would grow unhinged once more, reverting back to the terrifying heel persona he'd originally came into the company with, as he destroyed absolutely everyone in his path for the next 2 years. Then in 2004, he'd take his villainy a step further when he kidnapped Lita and made her marry him, with Lita later falling kayfabe pregnant with Kane's child, causing her to briefly side with him for a period. That was of course up until the point that she would abandon him for Edge, with this somehow once again turning the former Masked Star babyface. And during the period that followed, Kane would act as the ultimate utility player, able to be slotted into any position or storyline the company needed him to be in, no matter how ridiculous things got. So in 2010, as a reward for all this, he would get a run with the World Heavyweight title after defeating his brother on 3 successive pay-per-views, something which went a long way towards showing just how much respect both The Undertaker and WWE management had for him by now. After that, he'd once again don the mask when in 2011, he began going after John Cena in an attempt to get him to embrace the hate he was receiving from fans. And upon failing to do this, he would rebound by starting an odd couple tag team with Daniel Bryan that saw both men get to add new wrinkles to their characters by flexing their comedic muscles in a number of funny anger management segments. Not long after this, adding further dimensions to his character, Kane would start appearing as a corporate suit and tie clad version of himself, with this letting him portray more of an authority figure role for a while, as he once again breathed new life into his gimmick. Since this point though, his career has wound down, as after becoming mayor of Knox County in 2018, Glenn Jacobs has largely stepped away from the ring to focus on his political career. But while he was away, another masked star was only too happy to take up the mantle of WWE's resident horror movie villain, and that was none other than The Fiend. Yes, while Bray Wyatt had initially found fame in Vince McMahon's promotion as the Bayou cult leader of the Wyatt family, years of terrible booking had left this character dead in the water. And while some would have seen this as the death knell for their career, Bray, being one of the most creative minds in the industry, would just make up an entirely new gimmick for himself, one that, with a mask created by special effects legend Tom Savini, would start haunting WWE audiences in 2019 after a series of bizarre pre-taped segments saw Wyatt do his own version of Pee-wee's Playhouse, with him gradually using these to introduce the monster within him who, when unleashed, could not be stopped by anyone or anything. So after weeks of waiting then, The Fiend would finally be let loose when he attacked Finn Balor on the June 22nd episode of Raw, with this eventually leading to the two having a match at that August SummerSlam. And on that night, after coming out to one of the coolest entrances in recent memory, The Fiend would absolutely obliterate Balor, firmly establishing himself as the new top heel in the company in the process. Sadly though, this would mark the peak of the character, as after falling in love with what Bray was doing, Vince McMahon would rocket him up to the world title picture too soon, something which led to the now infamous Hell in a Cell match between him and Seth Rollins at that October's titular pay-per-view. And even when The Fiend won the WWE title soon after that, things would continue to stall, as with the boss now taking a more personal hand in the booking of the character, fans would quickly begin to tire of the sillier aspects of it. Still, this didn't stop Bray from trying to keep things on the rails, as whether it be his feuds with Randy Orton, Braun Strowman, or John Cena, the latter of which gave us the Lynchian nightmare that was the Firefly Funhouse match at WrestleMania 36, he'd give it his all every time and often make the situations he was put in more entertaining than they had any right to be. Unfortunately though, his best efforts wouldn't be enough to stop him from becoming part of a mass wave of releases made by WWE during 2021. However, as fate would have it, he'd be rehired by Triple H the following year, and ever since his return to the company last October, Bray hasn't gone back to the Fiend character yet. But no matter where he's going with this new incarnation of himself, we're confident that Bray will continue to make a huge impact on the industry, something which was certainly the case for a character who was only supposed to be a mid-carder, but ended up putting on the mask and turning into a full-blown superhero instead, the Hurricane. Yes, while he might have started off as Shane Helms working in WCW's mid-card division, it wasn't until he joined WWE in 2001 that he morphed into the company's resident crime fighter, from there becoming one of the most popular acts on the roster as he quickly won the European Championship from Matt Hardy. After that, the Hurricane formed a stable of sidekicks around himself, ones that included Lance Storm and Mighty Molly. Unfortunately though, despite their best efforts, they would never be able to win Tag Team Gold, and so, after moving back to the singles division in 2003 instead, he'd start a very memorable mini-feud with The Rock that saw him even pick up a win over the Great One on the March 10th episode of Raw that year. Then with this win giving him the boost he needed, the superhero was able to find new allies again when he started taking Rosie and Stacy Keibler under his wing, a partnership that would actually see Rosie and the Hurricane win Tag Team Gold together later that year. But as with all good things, this run would come to an end too, when in the autumn of 2005, after going on a losing streak, Shane Helms would revert back to his original persona after turning heel and dropping the mask. And this would be the role he would stay in up until 2008, at which point he would revive everyone's favorite superhero and go on a second run that eventually saw him move over to the ECW brand for a while. Then after his release from WWE in 2010, the Hurricane would take his act to the independent circuit, appearing at the likes of Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, Ring of Honor, and Total Nonstop Action, all before he'd make a series of cameo appearances for WWE and AEW between 2018 and 2021, there allowing fans to give him a few more hurrah pops. But while the Hurricane's secret identity as Shane Helms is well known by now, the same cannot be said for our next subject, Mr. America. Now, rumor actually has it that Mr. America is Hulk Hogan in disguise, but of course that's never been proven. That said, the two remain intertwined anyway, as after the Hulkster was kayfabe fired from WWE in 2003, the mysterious Mr. America would make his debut soon thereafter. And in Vince McMahon's demented mind, this could only mean that the two figures were one and the same, and that the whole thing was Hogan trying to get one over on him. Despite his best efforts though, McMahon would be unable to prove Mr. America's identity in the weeks that followed, even when he forced him to sit down for a lie detector test and flat out asked him if he was the architect of Hulkamania. No, on this occasion the masked star would clearly state that he was not Hulk Hogan, brother, something which should have been definitive enough proof for anyone that the two were different people. But still, even in the face of all this evidence, the boss didn't believe what he was seeing, and so, now having an axe to grind, would put the masked superstar into a match with Rowdy Roddy Piper at that May's Judgment Day pay-per-view. And sadly, even though he would win this match, soon after this, Mr. America would be fired from WWE when Vince McMahon was able to doctor footage to make it look like he'd removed his mask and revealed himself to have been Hulk Hogan all this time, something which we just can't bring ourselves to believe, even to this day.